This is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. You may have noticed some new faces on the back of your quarters. Over the past couple years, the U.S. Mint has been releasing a series of 25-cent coins celebrating women who have changed the course of history in the United States and around the world. And today is the release of a quarter featuring Zavala Shah, a writer, composer, educator, and political activist for Native American rights. Now, the American Women Quarters program is a series created in partnership with the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum. A total of 25 quarters will be released by the end of next year, with the election just over a week away and the possibility of seeing the first woman elected president in the U.S. These coins are a reminder of the vital role that women have played in shaping American culture and politics. Here to talk to us about this diverse list of women and the significance of this program is Professor Jennifer Brier, gender studies and history professor at University of Illinois at Chicago. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So this is, as I mentioned, a pretty diverse list of women that we've got here. Now, before we talk about them specifically, I wonder what you notice as a historian about just the significance of this particular group that was picked.
I was pretty surprised when I looked at the list. It's an unexpected list of women. Actually, not all of the people on the list are women, as we would define them or as they define themselves. Mm-hmm. And it's certainly not a whitewashed version of women's history. But what it does say to me is that when you put women, and in this case, gender nonconforming or gender non-binary people at the center of a story, it changes what you think about and what you find as significant. And so that, to me, as someone trained in women's history, is what stands out.
Absolutely. So we wanted to take a moment to really learn about these women featured. And as I mentioned, today the quarter featuring Zavala Shah is being released. So let's start with her. What should we know?
Well, we should know that she was a Yankton, Dakota Sioux woman. She was a composer and an educator and a political activist. She was born in 1876. And she was taken from land in South Dakota where she and her people lived and brought and trained in an Indiana, so closer to us, an Indiana Indian boarding school as a child. And there's a long history of boarding schools. You as a Canadian have a particular understanding of that. But what those boarding schools did to extract and disconnect Native children from their lands and their peoples is really an important thing for us to talk about. And she was a writer and a musician and a violinist, a librettist. And she fought for Native American citizenship and Native American suffrage for most of her adult life. So when you think about, you hear the word suffrage and you think about women's history, you're often thinking about women's suffrage. And for Redbird, as she was also known, she was really committed to making sure that Native Americans were able to vote. And so that's not the case probably until about 1965.
Yeah, but hugely significant. And today, as I said, is her day, right? So on the list, we've got some recognizable names. We've got poet Maya Angelou on there. The first woman in space, Sally Ride. I think their coins were released last year or in the last 2 years. First Lady and human rights activist Eleanor Roosevelt. But also there are some people who have been buried in history, right? I've got a short list here if you can sort of talk about some of these women whose, stories aren't often told, right, Professor? Jovita Idar, a Mexican-American journalist, activist, teacher, and suffragist.
Yeah, a really interesting woman who you might also there are so many interesting pairings and connections among the people on this list. Idar could be paired quite easily with someone more familiar to us in Chicago, Ida B. Wells. They're both journalists. They're committed to fighting against lynching. In the case of Wells, the lynching primarily of Black men and also some Black women at the hands of white supremacists. For Idar, it's fighting against lynching of Mexican and Mexican Americans, primarily in Texas, where she lived. So they have this very strong connection in this idea of what journalism can do,
Yes.
and how journalists have to be part of a fight against police violence or other forms of white supremacist violence.
And as we mentioned, Ida B. Wells, we should note she's got a quarter coming next year,
and
I
a
believe.
drive that takes us right to this very building.
Are you as excited about that one as I am?
I am pretty excited about it.
Yeah. On this year's list is also Maria Tallchief, America's first prima ballerina.
Yeah, I mean, there's a really interesting thread of Indigenous history on this list that I think is worth noting. And as we're thinking about the election and suffrage and what it means to vote, there are a lot of stories here that we might tell. And one of them is very much about how Indigenous women have been at the forefront of allowing us to understand different forms of political power and authority. And so I think it's important to sort of see that here woven throughout the list.
Yeah, a few more here. The Reverend Dr. Polly Murray, who's a poet, writer, activist, lawyer, and Episcopal priest. Anna May Wong, the first Chinese-American film star in Hollywood. Incredible list here. And Wilma Mankiller, the first woman elected principal chief of the Cherokee Nation.
The Cherokee Nation.
So there's that through line that you were talking about.
Exactly.
So aside from the ones that we've mentioned, talk more about other names that particularly stand out to you.
So the name that stands out to me, there are a range of them, and you've mentioned them. The one you haven't yet is Dr. Mary Edwards Walker, who was a Civil War surgeon and a women's rights and dress reform advocate. And she's born in upstate New York in 1832, which is a sort of hotbed for white women's suffrage in that time period in the mid-19th century. Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. She wore men's clothing for her entire life. She called them her clothing. I mean, she didn't think of them as men's clothing. They were the things that were really comfortable to her. And she was a surgeon in the Civil War. She was held hostage by the Confederacy. And even in that imprisonment, refused to wear women's clothes. She's the only woman to ever have received the Congressional Medal of Honor.
Oh, really?
Yeah. She wore it was stripped from her in 1916 or 1917 and ultimately reinstated by Jimmy Carter in 1977. But she wore the Congressional Medal of Honor on her coat lapel. And there are pictures of she traveled the country in full men's clothes. And she came here to Chicago, and there are amazing photographs of her in full coattails with the medal that she wore, and she carried around the original document from Congress, and she said that it allowed her to wear the men's clothes even as she was arrested regularly for wearing men's clothes.
Interesting. And she finally made the list.
Yeah.
So, again, going back to that through line that you were talking about before, right? That from the type of work that these women did to the racial diversity that we've got here. I neglected to mention the first woman of color to serve in Congress, Patsy Takamoto Mink.
Right.
What do you make of this entire list?
I think about what it means to put these people at the center of our story to help us understand the sort of history of the United States. It really changes things when these people are here. And I think it says something about the fact that we can't assume that women don't have race and that class doesn't matter, and that in the case of the way Indigenous women are represented here, that nation states don't matter, that there's sovereignty here.
Yeah.
And that it really is an opportunity for us to understand that you can tell all of the big historical events of the last 400 years through the lens of gender. And it helps us see things in ways that we wouldn't otherwise see it.
If you're just tuning in, this is Reset. I'm Sasha-Ann Simons. The U.S. Mint and the Smithsonian American Women's History Museum, they're collaborating in a quarters program. It's to release coins with the faces of 25 women throughout history who have changed this country and the world. And we're discussing that with Jennifer Brier, who's a gender studies and history professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago. So, Professor, I can't help but feel the irony of we got women featured on money when we see that there's still a pretty big pay gap between men and women, right? Some stats here. According to the Department of Labor, as of 2024, on average, women working full-time year-round, they're paid 84% of what men are paid. I mean, the gap, as we know, is much wider for women of color.
Yes.
Do you see connections here between the role of money, who we're seeing being featured, and how in our economy women continue to face this kind of inequality?
Well, they are being featured on the quarter. So I think that is significant. I'm not saying
and that was going to be my next question.
Yeah, it is the quarter. It's
your point being a coin and not
a coin,
not a bill.
Not a bill. It's also a relatively small denomination, not a large denomination. And Washington is still on the front. He's on the head side, and they're on the tail side. That's how it's described. So I think there's a lot of symbolism here. We could talk about a lot of ways to interpret what these coins mean. Nothing is all good and nothing is all bad. But to really raise these economic questions are critical at this moment. These women also, even as they were sometimes the first to do something, right? So whether it's the first Episcopal priest or the first and only woman to win the Congressional Medal of Honor, whatever that first was, it wasn't the only thing that they did in their lifetimes. And that's true for the people who were suffragists. It's true for people like Ida B. Wells. It's true for all of these people, that there was an understanding that all of these issues were interconnected to one another. And economic well-being and an idea of equity is really at the heart of what many of these women and gender nonconforming people did.
Yeah.
And that brings you back to someone like Pauli Murray, who identified, came up with the term Jane Crow, which was a way of talking about gender discrimination along the lines of Jim Crow and sort of anti-Black white supremacy. And what Pauli Murray did was, in essence, stitch these things together through, I would not say through her, through their life. They were a person who, over the course of their life, struggled in many different kinds of battles, was part of many different kinds of social movements to affect change. And so the economic piece of this is critical. These are symbolic things and they matter, but they aren't the only way that we are ever going to affect political and economic change.
You know, learning about historical figures this way, it seems like an inroad to a broader representation of these women and the work that they did. But like you've said, a lot of these women are not very well known. So I wonder, is this kind of representation, could this be an inroad to perhaps them being integrated into curriculum more broadly? You mentioned earlier, I grew up in Canada. I was surprised to learn from the folks I work with here that some of these people weren't part of the history books in school here in the U.S.
What's in K-12 curriculum is a deeply politicized space right now. It's always been politicized, but it's particularly politicized right now. And Illinois has recently passed some of the most progressive K-12 curriculum, an inclusive curriculum. And I think some of these women can be stitched, some of these people can be stitched into that curriculum in Illinois. Many of these people moved through Illinois at different parts. So just to sort of name, that curriculum is largely locally based. It's not something national.
Yeah.
But there are these kinds of national spaces where we can engage in this kind of historical exploration. And that's why the museum, the Women's History Museum, which is really trying to take off and will live alongside the American Indian Museum, the African American Museum, the National Museum of American History. This is really the question, like, do these national sites come to take on, how can they get us to change the way we think about history inside the classroom and outside the classroom? But that is what it's going to take.
We'll leave it there. We've been speaking with Dr. Jennifer Brier, who's professor of gender and women's studies and history at the University of Illinois at Chicago. Thank you so much for the history lesson.
Thanks.
Good to have you.